So glad you're with us today. How do you fill in that blank? Am I blank enough? There are so many ways we can fill in that blank. Am I smart enough? Am I attractive enough? Am I rich enough? Am I successful enough? We are in a series of conversations where we're filling in those blanks. We're getting serious about those blanks and the places those blanks keep us from living the life that God intended for us to live. So we've had a conversation about, am I worthy enough? And in that, we have to realize that we have to live in what God thinks about us and what God says about us, not what others think about us and say about us. We've had a conversation about, am I good enough? Am I living from favor or for favoritism? And today, in this conversation, we're going to talk about, am I popular enough? Am I famous enough? Have I made it? Have I arrived? You see, deep within each and every single one of us, God has put a God-given desire for significance. And David, King David from the Old Testament, was not exempt from that. We've been reading about and studying about David as we fill in these blanks, and I hope you've been reading and studying along with us. There's a reading plan. You'll find it at aldersgate.info. You can jump in at any time, read about David's life, but he was not exempt from this desire for significance. You see, David was anointed king as a young boy, but it was some 15 years before he would be appointed king. But here's what David learned. On his journey to what he thought would be his significance, which was becoming the king, he realized that he was just as significant, or maybe even more significant, on the journey, not the destination. So let me ask you a question. What if you never become king? Whatever that is for you. Whatever that popularity, whatever that level of fame, whatever that level of success is for you. What if you never arrive? Am I popular enough? If we really get serious about that, it will grab us, all right? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at David's life, and we're going to look at 3 scenes out of David's life to talk about, am I popular enough? Am I famous enough? And because really, significance and popularity are not synonymous terms, okay? So we're going to look at 3 scenes out of David's life, and we're going to answer 3 questions. The first question is this: am I living the ordinary in an extraordinary way? You see, oftentimes we're waiting on the extraordinary, and while we're waiting on the extraordinary, am I living the ordinary in an extraordinary way? And the scene we're going to look at out of David's life to help us relate to this is the scene of David and Goliath. You'll find it in 1 Samuel chapter 17, so if you've got a Bible in your lap or Bible app or whatever you've got, I would encourage you to go ahead and turn there. If you're not familiar with the story, so David's been anointed king. The prophet, priest Samuel came and anointed him king. He was a shepherd boy, completely, totally forgotten by his father, overlooked by his brothers, and he actually ends up on the battlefield not to fight Goliath. He ends up there because his father asked him to go check on his brothers, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, and to take them some food. And so he ends up here on this battlefield merely to check on his brothers, and he ends up taking down the giant Goliath. Let's look at just a couple of verses. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 46 and 47 says this: "This day," underline that, "this day, the Lord will deliver you into my hand." He's trash talking Goliath here, all right? "And I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's." Underline that, okay? Now, all that trash talk is really good, but underline "this day," and "for the battle is the Lord's." and he will give you into our hand. Underline this day, because it was on this day that David lived the ordinary in an extraordinary way. But it wasn't just this day, it was every day of David's life that he lived the ordinary in an extraordinary way. We get glimpses into that in other places. In fact, in this story of David and Goliath, we get a glimpse into that because we're told in verses 34 and 36 that he killed a lion and a bear with his bare hands. A B-E-A-R with his B-A-R-E hands. And he did that while no one was watching. He was protecting his flock, the sheep that he was entrusted to. And when a lion and a bear came after his flock, he went after them and he killed them. And guess what? No one was watching. Will we do, when we're not there, what we want to do when we are there? Well, let me say it this way. What we do when we're not there will determine what we do when we are there. You see, and David had this habit of making the ordinary extraordinary. On this day, today, when God opens doors, when God presents opportunities, when God gives us places to step into it. That's how we make the ordinary extraordinary. And God gives us those opportunities every day. Oftentimes we get caught praying, God, if you would just do this, God, if you would just do this, God, if you would just do that. And we make these great prayers, but we're not willing to move our feet. We're not willing to step into those things. We're not willing to make the ordinary extraordinary. Here's the thing though. When we face things we've never expected, we have the opportunity to find God in ways we've never experienced Him. Making the ordinary extraordinary. Let me say it this way. We want Goliath testimonies, but we spend all of our time fighting munchkins. When God presents a Goliath, go after it and make the ordinary extraordinary. But let me before you get all hyped up, let me cue in on this too. For the battle is the Lord's. Okay? Don't be fighting Goliath if God didn't say go fight Goliath. Okay? Like if God's not saying take on Goliath, then stick with the munchkin. Okay? But if God is saying take on Goliath, go take on Goliath, and He does it more than we think He does it. Remember the story of Peter walking on water? Right? All the disciples are in a boat. This big storm comes up. Jesus comes walking on the water to the boat. And Peter steps out of the boat and begins to walk on water. But first, he said, God, is it you? Jesus, is it you? And if so, I'll step out of the boat and begin to walk on water. Now we know the rest of the story. Peter actually took his eyes off of Jesus, began to sink. But listen, none of the other disciples walked on water. Peter made the ordinary extraordinary on this day because God said, the battle is the Lord's. Let me give it to you this way. Paul says it in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 15 through 17. This is actually a New Living Translation. So be careful how you live. Don't live like fools, but like those who are wise. Make the most of every opportunity in these evil days. On this day, make the most of every opportunity. Don't act thoughtlessly, but understand what the Lord wants you to do. On this day, God will give you opportunities. He will open doors. The question is, will you seize that opportunity? Will you walk through that door? And will you make the ordinary extraordinary? Quit looking at the munchkins and look for the Goliaths and seize them if God says seize them. Okay? So question number one, am I living the ordinary in an extraordinary way? And we get that from looking at David and Goliath. Let me add a second question, okay, that we need to ask ourselves. Am I submitting to the work God is wanting to do in me? Am I submitting to the work that God is wanting to do in me? See, often we want to get to the destination. We want to get to that arrival place, whatever we think is popular or famous or successful or whatever. But right now, today, am I submitting to the work that God wants to do in me? Okay? And the scene we look at from David's life here is the scene of David and Saul. So, David was, after he was anointed, he began to serve Saul. He began to play the harp for Saul. And it was part-time. He would do that, and he would go back and tend to his sheep that he was to tend to. But after the whole thing with Goliath, David begins to serve Saul permanently. And I want to read from 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 6 through 9. It says, as they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, that's Goliath, okay? So after the battle with Goliath, the women came out of all the city of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women saying to one another as they celebrated, Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Uh-oh. There's a problem here, especially for Saul, right? Because all of a sudden, David's popularity is escalating and Saul's popularity is not. And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom? And watch this. Saul eyed David from that day on. He did more than eye him. He eyed him and he threw spears at him. On 3 different occasions, David had to dodge a spear that Saul literally became mad. His envy and jealousy, because he was not popular enough, drove him mad. And he literally began to attack David on 3 different occasions. You can read about it in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 11, and 1 Samuel chapter 19, verse 10. Saul throws a spear at David, and David has to dodge it. Not only that, the prize for defeating Goliath, it was public knowledge, was that whoever defeated Goliath would be given King Saul's daughter in marriage, his daughter Merab. But on David's wedding day, Saul said, no, and he gave him another one of his daughters. This was extremely humiliating. And so Saul had to begin running David had to begin running for his own life. Literally, he had to begin fleeing from Saul because Saul was after him. And this is when David's popularity was rising. David's popularity is gaining with all the people. Listen to me. Celebrations over our life can be used by the enemy into setting us up as king before we are ready. And what's happening in David's life is God wants to do a work in him so that he can truly become the king. See, God has anointed David king, but he's not appointed because God knows there's more work to be done in David's life before he's ready to take the throne. And oftentimes we see in our life that this is where we want to be. This is where we want to arrive. This is our destination. This is our popularity, whatever that is for us. And maybe God does indeed have that in store for us, but he knows we're not ready for that. And there's more work that he wants to do in our life to get us to that place. On 2 different occasions, David could have killed King Saul. He could have put all of this to an end. He could have killed King Saul and become the king himself. You can read about those occasions in 1 Samuel chapter 24, 1 Samuel chapter 26. But on both of those occasions, David honors the office of the king, honors the authority of King Saul, and does not take Saul's life. Listen to me, listen to me, listen to me. It's easier to kill your Goliath than to protect your Saul. And oftentimes what God wants to do in our lives is he wants us to protect our Saul because he's got things to work in our lives before he's ready to take us to the next place. The question is, are we willing to submit to the work that God wants to do in us? Let me tell you a contemporary story. Perhaps you're knowledgeable of the famous comedian Dave Chappelle. Dave Chappelle had a show on Comedy Central. I think it began in 2003. It was called The Chappelle Show. And at the time, Comedy Central wasn't a popular station or channel, but the Chappelle Show literally took it to the next level. I mean, literally. The Chappelle Show is a sketch comedy show. Usually it's kind of politically incorrect and it's very controversial, but in our culture, Chappelle became very popular for that, okay? Let me just give you some statistics. His show became the highest rated program on Comedy Central, and it earned 3 Emmy nominations. The first season was released on DVD, and it became the best-selling TV show in DVD history. That's crazy. The second season of The Chappelle Show, when it was released on DVD, broke sales records. It sold 500,000 copies in one day and 1.2 million copies in 1 week. Here's what I'm getting you to realize. This is crazy fame. This is crazy popularity. And in the third season of the show, in April of 2005, just weeks after signing a 2-year, $50 million deal with Comedy Central, Chappelle walked off the show, left the set. Not only did he leave the show, not only did he leave the set, he left the country. He got on a plane and he went to Africa, and he didn't tell anyone. He didn't even tell his wife and kids. He told his brother to tell a few specific people. He later admits that wasn't the brightest idea not to tell his wife. But he left and went to Africa and got away. And a few days, well, actually months later, he ends up on Oprah's couch. Everybody ends up on Oprah's couch, right? And he begins to tell this story about why he left, why he walked away from this huge fame, this huge popularity, this huge success. And here's what he said. Sometimes our success will take us to places our character can't sustain us. Oh, that's good. And that's not unique to Chappelle. It's a quote that's been used by several different people through the years. But that's sometimes what God wants to do in us. He knows that we're not ready for that place, whatever that place is, because our character isn't ready for that place. And He wants to do the work in our lives to get us ready for that place. The question is, will we submit to the work that God wants to do in our lives? All right, third question. Third question we have to ask ourselves when we're talking about, am I popular enough or am I successful enough? Am I willing to invest in others and what God is doing in them? Am I willing to invest in others and what God is doing in them, even if I don't feel like I've arrived, okay? Or if I don't feel like I'm where God wants me to be. And the scene we'll look at in David's life here is David and his mighty men. Now you can read about David and his mighty men. Let's look briefly at 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 1 through 2, okay? So as David departed from there, David was on the run for his life, okay? He's fleeing from Saul. And he departs from there and he escapes to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to Adullam to meet him. And everyone, watch this, everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in soul, have you ever been there, bitter in soul? Gathered to him. And he became the commander over them. He became the influencer over them. And there were with him about 400 men. And David went from there to Mizpah of Moab. And he said to the king of Moab, please let my father and mother stay with you, watch, till I know what God will do for me. Wow. That's what David's saying. I don't know what God has in store for me. I know I'm an anointed king. I don't know when that's going to take place. I don't know what God has for me. Like I'm wanting to get to this place. Like I have this desire for significance, and maybe it is popularity, or maybe it is this fame, or whatever I'm looking for. But I don't know exactly how God's going to do that or how God's going to work that out. Here's what I know. In the meantime, I'm going to live the ordinary in an extraordinary way. And I know I'm going to submit to the work that God wants to do in my life. And also, I'm going to invest in others and what God is doing in them. David's hiding out in a cave. And all of these people, and let me tell you, they were not popular people. They were not famous people. They were people in distress. They were people in debt. They were people that were bitter in soul. And David could have gone, oh God, really? Like, what are you doing to me, right? Like, not only have I run into my life, but now you're bringing all of these down and out people. All of those people, you're bringing into me? Seriously, God, what are you doing to me? I mean, these people are anything but popular. But during David's own dark time, he was giving other people hope. He was willing to invest in others, even when he wasn't sure what God was doing in him. 1 Samuel chapter 30, there's a story about David and these mighty men, and they had left with the Philistines to actually go to battle against Saul and the Israelites, Saul and his army. And the Philistines, yes, the same people. I mean, David had just killed Goliath. Goliath was a Philistine, right? This is where David ends up. He's hiding out with the Philistines. And because the Philistines begin to think, oh, no. David, you're going to turn your back on it. Like, you're really going to end up fighting for the Israelites, and you're going to turn your back and betray us. And David tried to convince them that that wasn't the case. But nonetheless, they wouldn't let David and his mighty men go to battle with them. But while they were gone, they were in a place called Ziklag. While they were gone, they returned to Ziklag, and the Amalekites had come in and taken all of Ziklag. They had burned it to the ground and taken everything, all their possessions, including their wives and their children. And the mighty men that David had invested in betrayed him. They were so upset and so distressed and so angry about what had happened, they wanted to stone David. They wanted to kill David. 1 Samuel chapter 30, verse 6. And David was greatly distressed. We can say depressed. For the people spoke of stoning him because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. But watch this. David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. God sometimes has to bring us to places where the only person left to depend on is God. The only person we have left to trust is God himself. God often has to get us to the end of ourself before we can trust in him and believe in him and depend on him. God can't elevate us to greater ends until we come to the end of ourselves. And when David got to that place, he spoke into those mighty men and he led them in battle against the Amalekites. And with God's help, they had this miraculous victory. What if the most significant thing in your life is not what you achieve, but rather what you equip others to achieve? What if the most significant thing in your life is not any trophy you win, but rather a person you win over? What if the most significant thing in your life is not anything you do, but rather someone you raise? I get to see this on a daily basis working as the pastor at Aldersgate Church. You are blessed with a staff here who are sometimes living in their own dark caves, in their own hopeless places, in their own strongholds. And yet I get to see them pour into the life of others every single day. Am I willing to invest in others, even when I don't think God's doing the work he should be doing in my life? In Acts chapter 13, verse 36, it says, David served God's purpose in his own generation. That, my friends, is significance. Serving God's purpose for my life in my generation. Am I willing to make the ordinary extraordinary? Am I willing to submit to the work that God wants to do in me? And am I willing to invest in others and what God is doing in them? If I can say yes to those three questions, then I am living a significant life. And that is all God asks of me. And it's all God asks of you. So, are you popular enough? If you're doing those things, the answer is yes.